Welcome. We are so glad that you tuned in today for the GrapeSEED sponsored webinar, Fostering Oral Language. I am Jennifer McDonald, the Training and Implementation Manager for GrapeSEED. Today, you are going to be learning new ways to focus your class on oral language development. Oral language development is proven to be the foundational element of language use and ability and is a must in teaching all areas of language acquisition. Today's presenter is Paula Lutze. Paula has been working in education for over 10 years. She has a master's in TESOL and has had the privilege of teaching many different grade levels as an English language teacher, including being able to teach overseas. Before joining the GrapeSEED team, Paula used GrapeSEED with her own students. She is currently a professional learning specialist who supports GrapeSEED teachers in the United States. With that being said, I would like to introduce you to Paula Lutze.
Thanks so much, Jennifer. Again, like Jennifer said, we're so glad that you're joining us for this session. And I am a professional learning specialist with GrapeSEED, and I'm very excited to walk you through ways to foster oral language in the classroom. Okay, so I would like to start and just take a minute and talk about what we're going to be covering today. First, I'm going to address why oral language is so important. The second thing I'm going to go over with are our 3 recommendations that I have for you on how to foster oral language in your classroom. After each recommendation, I'm going to give you some tips on how to implement these recommendations into your class times. Okay, so let's start with why oral language is so important. First, oral language is the foundation for communication. As we see with the study of first language acquisition, we learn to speak in our native language before we learn other forms of communication, such as reading and writing. The second thing is oral language has been discovered as a key to literacy development. Research has shown more and more that oral language builds the foundation for reading so that learners understand what they are reading and the vocabulary required for reading, which will also help them understand how to write. When we begin writing, we often write how we would speak. If it's difficult to speak, our writing will most likely not be understood. And then the third point is oral language proficiency comes with use. The more students speak the target language, the more proficient they become. The California Department of Education has conducted a lot of research on English language development and have found that the more learners practice using the target language, the more proficient and confident they become. So now I'm going to talk to you about my 3 recommendations on how to foster oral language in your classroom. Number 1. Teachers need to make time to focus on oral language. Making a set of time for oral language instruction during your classes will help the learners focus on speaking. There are many ways to incorporate oral language development all throughout your classes, but taking a time that's set to focus specifically on oral language will help foster speaking in your students. My second recommendation is creating an environment for oral language. Brown talked about teachers needing to create a comfortable environment for speaking. If students do not feel comfortable, their affective filter will be high, and they'll be less likely to try and communicate or take risks. We want our students to be confident and feel like it's okay to make mistakes and take risks in our classrooms. My third recommendation is incorporating different types of questions throughout your class. Questions can be a great way to have students elaborate what they're speaking and discover how to use the language more fully. We will talk more about different types of questions a little later. If we, as teachers, allow enough time for our students to benefit from the proper environment, and if we learn to facilitate organic responses and questions from our students, we should start to see our classes become a place that cultivates oral language. Let's look more at the power of allotting time to focus on oral language. Dertro, Levy, and Moore discussed how academic achievement involves taking part in the classroom through listening with comprehension, speaking confidently and accurately, and reading and writing. For learners to meet this academic achievement, they need sufficient time. Saunders, Foreman, and Carlson found that with a specific block of time set aside for oral language development, learners achieved higher oral language composite scores, higher word identification scores, and a tendency towards higher letter sound scores. Setting time aside for oral language practice will help nurture learners' desire to speak and strengthen their oral language outcomes. Learners who are engaged with the language have multiple opportunities to practice and become more fluent. Kayadar found that learners who have fewer opportunities to talk will not have as many chances to be corrected, and that could negatively impact their fluency and language acquisition. Okay, so I'm going to give you a little bit of time just to think in terms of reflection right now. I want you to think about how you can incorporate time for oral language before I give you some tips in the following slides. I want you to think about your class, how much time you have, and your students. What are some activities you could do? Where are some places throughout your day or class period that you could focus on oral skills? So think about these things as I take you through these slides. Research has found that pair and group activities allow learners more chances to speak, and that in pair activities, students speak more full, complex sentences. Learners will also have more language production in pairs and groups than during whole class discussions. Throughout the class, you can break learners into groups or pairs to discuss what they just read or listened to. They could even practice speaking specific language functions. Do a turn and talk after new content is introduced, or a think, pair, share. You can also group students together to complete tasks that are constructive and purposeful. Teachers do need to be mindful of which students to group together so that everyone is participating and one or a few students are not dominating the speaking time, because that can easily happen. Oral language activities are a great way to build learners' oral language proficiency and overall fluency. Some examples of language activities are show and tell, debates for older students, role play activities, and pre-listening, pre-reading, and pre-writing activities that give learners a chance to use their existing knowledge to speak, build vocabulary, and reinforce what they're going to be listening to or reading or writing. Show and tell can help students of all ages describe and share about themselves. Using an object gives the learner something concrete to talk about and can lower the affective filter. Debates are good for older learners to work on vocabulary required for arguing, persuading, and stating facts. It's a great activity to use for building academic language. Role plays using authentic materials give learners opportunities practicing language needed in real-life situations and scenarios. By cultivating your classes to include activities done before listening, reading, or writing, you're always providing opportunities for learners to discuss what they will be working on later while you build comprehension and necessary vocabulary. Some different types of materials you can use to help develop oral language are songs, stories, shared reading big books, and poems. Research shows that songs build fluency and help with recall. Music crosses over to both sides of the brain and creates new neural pathways for language learning. Stories develop comprehension and fluency through repeated readings. Learners will also be exposed to different types of sentence structures and patterns. Reading stories engages students in discussion, which builds their ability to communicate and improves confidence. Stories also repeat and expand students' vocabulary and language functions. Shared reading big books and poems introduce and build concepts of print, as well as exposing students to conversational English. I've shared some examples on the slide, so looking for materials that have high frequency words and common language expressions will give the exposure your students need to use the language on their own. So if you look at my song up here on the slide, for example, if you look at the language in it, where is Artie? How are you this morning? I'm fine. Those are things that the students are going to be able to use right away and actually remember because it's presented in song form and it helps with recall. If you look at the shared reading poem, I like ice cream. Tanya does too. Sam likes ice cream. How about you? That's a very common expression that the students are going to be able to use to express an I like structure. And then you can also change out names with Tanya and Sam and put the student's own name in there. So it's a great way for them to realize that this language is used from their own perspective. So these are just some examples I have for you. Dertro Moran pointed out the idea of using opportunities that occur throughout the day to encourage discussion and deepen learners' language abilities. These teachable moments are spontaneous but powerful when used to work on vocabulary and learners' oral language abilities. An example of this could be if learners are trying to describe something but do not know the word, then the teacher can take a moment and work on vocabulary or synonyms. Another example could be a story that sparks the learner's interest and creates a discussion. Teachers can use those moments to have the students express themselves. They could dive into what the story is about and actually use oral language to discuss more and develop that skill. But we as teachers do need to be mindful that these teachable moments are effective and efficient. Some learners can lose interest if the teachable moment takes too long. Now let's talk about why we should create a comfortable speaking environment. Hadaway, Vardell, and Young wrote, "The classroom environment that we create is critical to fostering a firm foundation of oral language development. Learners need to feel comfortable enough to speak without a fear of making mistakes. When they are less afraid to make mistakes, learners will spend more time practicing the language." You can even think about this from your own perspective if you've ever tried to learn a language. When you have a lot of fear in speaking out, you won't speak out, and therefore you never actually become fluent in the language. When the classroom is fun and inviting, you want to talk with your peers, you want to talk to the teacher, and therefore you practice speaking more. Now, having a lower affective filter helps students participate more, feel more confident, and look forward to coming back to class. Friendships will also be established quicker in a comfortable environment, thus making class time more fun and a place where learners are not afraid to share about themselves or their own cultures. As teachers, we should strive to not only build on academics or workplace success, but build up the individual learner as well. Purdy wrote about how a respectful learning environment with meaningful conversations will benefit every student. A great way to create that respectful learning environment is to show learners that they actually do contribute to the class and that they can share about themselves and their culture. Okay, so we're going to take a little minute again for reflection. So I just want you to take a moment and think about your classroom. Is it welcoming and warm? What are some ways you could make your classroom a place where students love to speak? So I want you to keep these things in mind as we go through the next section. So how do I create a comfortable speaking environment? Building rapport with students is the first step to making them feel comfortable. This can be done by always being friendly, even when you don't feel like it, learning about your students' interests, their families, their backgrounds, and their current living situations. Another way is to have open body language. You build rapport with our open body language. Especially when we have limited communications ability, you have gestures, facial expressions, intonation, that can have a huge impact on our learners' perspective of the class and you as the teacher. Hadaway, Vardell, and Young recommended sharing with students that errors are a natural part of the language learning process. Helping learners realize that mistakes are natural will build rapport and alleviate some stress involved with speaking, which lowers the affective filter. Understanding that everyone makes mistakes will help learners be less afraid to try different forms of communication themselves and will help them be more likely to participate in classroom activities. Now let's talk a little bit more about the lowering of the affective filter. Okay. This is an action activity. Action activities utilize Asher's total physical response, allowing students the opportunity to physically demonstrate their comprehension without being forced into verbal production before they're ready. With action activities, all students are able to participate in language learning regardless of what their language abilities are. So it's a great first step in creating that comfortable speaking environment, because it helps lower the affective filter because our students are not being put on the spot to speak before they're ready. Research also shows that gross motor development and cognitive development are very closely linked. As you can see within the text of this action activity, there are fun actions filled with common vocabulary and phrases. So if you look at the words, this is how monkeys climb, let's climb, and that's repeated, which also helps the students feel more comfortable. And again, this is language that they can apply because they're going to hear it over and over again so that they're going to be able to use it. So let's talk a little bit more about creating that comfortable speaking environment. Parrish listed ideas on how to create a warm, comfortable environment. She mentioned making language expressions or function strips or charts and hanging them up where learners can access them when communicating. These visual expressions help learners feel more at ease because they have language to reference if needed. Parrish also recommended putting common vocabulary words up to help learners who may need assistance when filling in their language gaps. So if the students know these are hanging in their classroom, it can kind of help them feel at ease because they know to just glance if they need help or assistance. Another way is creating bulletin boards that showcase learners' academic achievements, their writings, and pictures of their families. It helps them feel like they're contributing to the class. These displays help each learner feel that they're a vital part of a classroom family. And when we feel as though we are a part of something, it helps us take responsibility for ourselves, and in this case, our own learning. The bulletin board that my slide is made up was taken from Parrish's book. It's an adult class that wrote about their language experiences, and she just posted it up on a bulletin board with pictures. Now, let's talk about asking questions and why it's important. Questions can be a vital element in fostering an interactive classroom. Veitch states that speculative and process questions initiate conversations for learning. By guessing and analyzing through questioning, learners are able to dive deeper into the language and understanding that language. Kai Adar pointed out that through questions, learners can actively participate in the dialogue, which enables them to contribute to their own learning and the learning of others. This also helps students to pay attention to their own understanding, because questions cause students to constantly interact with one another. Through these interactions, students will realize where they have gaps in their understanding and in their ability to get their point across to the other person. Teachers can use open-ended questions to draw out spontaneous discourse, which allows learners to think on a deeper level and gives teachers an assessment of their students' understanding. Listening to how learners answer will help teachers make notes on what parts of language their students struggle to use or are very successful at using. Having learners elaborate on their answers will also promote a fuller oral language environment. So this up here is an example of a chant. Chants enable students to learn both what to say, using the right words, and how to say it with the right voice inflection. They can provide a fun, natural context for learning most language functions, especially questions. The more question patterns a student is familiar with, the more confident they will become at using the pattern on their own and expanding on them. As you can see in this example, there are two questions being asked, and the students can see that the question requires a response, and it can be used to gather more information. So if I ask, what is this? Another person is supposed to respond, this is a card. And then they could even go further and elaborate more off of that with another question. So it's a great way to create that foundation and a memory bank for questioning. All right, so how can I use questioning to foster oral language? By asking questions that pursue more information and receiving the answers, learners gain more understanding and continue to interact with each other. In order to teach learners how to ask questions, teachers need to consistently model the types of questions they want their students to use. Vaish did a study that showed students tend to model the types of questions asked by their teachers. If students model the question patterns of their teachers, then teachers should try to ask more open-ended questions and questions that elicit more elaborate answers from their students. Students also need teachers to model what speculative and process questions look like so that they can participate more in conversational learning. Purdy gave a warning about forming questions that only elicit a single word answer because then it becomes difficult to extend the learner's language. When teachers pre-plan their questions, they specifically need to keep in mind the answers they expect from their students. Pre-planning allows us to avoid asking closed questions or questions that require a simple answer. Different activities during class time can be used to plan different types of questions. After a reading lesson, for example, have students work on speculative questions. After a listening activity, have students work on questions that analyze what they listen to. When thinking about fostering oral language, questions need to focus on having learners think deeper and formulate more complex answers. Vaish wrote that there is no doubt one way of eliciting real talk is by well-planned questions asked by the teacher. So just a few minutes ago, we talked about teaching learners how to ask questions through our modeling. Now we're going to talk about providing opportunities for learners to ask questions. Throughout your class time, there are many different places to have students ask questions. You can tell students before a reading session that you want them to pay close attention because you want them to ask one question about what was read after they're finished. After a writing assignment, you can have students read what they wrote to a partner, and then the partner asks one or two questions about what they heard. I personally liked having question of the day, which is where I wrote a different question every day up on the whiteboard, because I was able to show my students many different types of questions. And then as the class progressed, I assigned different students to come up with question of the day. Sorry, go back here for a second. I wanted to give you one more example. Another example that you can use to get your students to ask questions is to use pictures. So you can have your students look at a picture and ask questions based on what they see. I used to use all kinds of different pictures to get my students to use a wide range of vocabulary and formulate different types of questions. So these are just a few examples of how you can give opportunities throughout the day for your students to become fluent in asking questions. I also recommend just sharing ideas with other teachers and just being really creative. Now I just want to conclude and kind of recap what we kind of went over here. First, we talked about time. Making sure learners are given time to focus on their oral skills is crucial throughout the class time. It is necessary that students hear the target language for them to be motivated to increase proficiency and understanding. The more time given to speaking practice, the better our learners will become. Next, we talked about the environment. Fostering an environment for oral language is critical because it's the key foundational aspect of second language acquisition. Learners need to have an environment in which oral language is fun and expected. People learn languages through practicing and making mistakes. A learning environment needs to reflect a strong expectation of both. And finally, we talked about asking questions. Asking questions that spur learners to elaborate and express themselves in longer conversations will build oral language expectation and skill. If teachers ask questions throughout the class that require thought and longer responses, students will become more confident with their expressive language. Students need daily opportunities to use the language if they're ever going to acquire it. So nurturing oral language is extremely vital. So my next 3 slides just show you my references. And again, when I get to the very last slide, if you would like to see these in more detail, you can email me about them. But I just wanted to thank you so much for joining me today with this session. I hope you enjoyed our session on fostering oral language in the classroom. And again, if you have any questions or comments, please feel free to contact me. My email is up on the slide. I'd be more than happy to talk with you. With that said, thanks again, and I'm going to give it back to Jen.
Thanks, Paula. It was great to hear about the importance of fostering oral language in the everyday classroom, of how important that is. And once again, we would like to thank everyone for joining. We hope you are able to take some of this information back and immediately use it in your classroom to help support your students. Thanks again, and have a great day.